Good evening. Welcome to the first of a four-panel series on religion and peace building that's being sponsored by the Initiative on Religion, Law, and Diplomacy and the Club on Religion, Law, and Diplomacy at the Fletcher School. I'm Professor Elizabeth Prodromo, and I'm the faculty director for the initiative. And it's really a pleasure to welcome everyone here on our panel this evening on religion and peace building. I want to mention that the Initiative on Religion, Law, and Diplomacy was established almost 7 years ago at the Fletcher School, and our mission is to increase and expand and deepen the religious literacy amongst all of those who are involved in scholarship, research, teaching, policy and practitioner preparation, studying, and fieldwork with regard to religion and contemporary international relations. So it's really a pleasure to welcome everyone here this evening as part of that effort. I'm going to introduce Shelby Sanger, who's a first-year Fletcher master's student and a member of the Student Club on Religion, Law, and Diplomacy. She's here also with Francois Venn and with Chris Pumford, leaders in the club on Religion, Law, and Diplomacy, and she's going to introduce our panelists, speakers, moderators for this evening. I just want to mention that tonight's event is indeed the launch of a four-part series for this semester. You can find the four panels online on tufts.edu/FletcherRLD. And the panels are tonight as well as on March 4th, March 11th, and April 1st on different dimensions of the connection between religion and peace building. Before I turn it over to Shelby, I want to thank all the panelists and our moderator discussant and emphasize that everybody's connected in some way to Fletcher. Dr. Chris Seipel is a Fletcher alum. Right Reverend Mark Eddington is also a Fletcher alum. Martine Miller works with a Fletcher alum, and Dr. Andrea Bartoli has actually come to Fletcher as part of other RLD work as well. So it's a pleasure to have you all here. And Professor Nassim Khoury is a professor at the Fletcher School. So we're all interconnected through RLD. So Shelby, with no further ado, I turn the evening over to you.
Thank you so much, Professor Prodromo. So tonight I have the honor of introducing our moderator discussant, Professor Nassim Khoury. Nassim Khoury is an adjunct assistant professor of international negotiations at the Fletcher School. As a consultant, mediator, and facilitator specializing in negotiation, influence, and conflict management, he's also a principal with CM Partners, a senior facilitator with Vantage Partners, and a senior advisor with Dragonfly Partners. He works with Fortune 100 companies, Israeli, Palestinian, and international diplomats and political leaders, the U.S. Air Force, and the U.S. Navy SEALs. He's a graduate of Bowdoin College and the Harvard Kennedy School. Last semester, I had the privilege of taking the fantastic course on international negotiations that he co-teaches here at the Fletcher School, and I'm so excited he was able to join us tonight. So I'll turn it over to you, Professor Khoury.
Great, thank you, Shelby, and thank you, Professor. It's a real pleasure to be with you all here today, and I'm not just saying that, I'll tell you why. So teaching a course in international negotiation, looking at international conflict from a wide lens is one thing I do. Another thing I do is work with clients specifically on their issues of conflict. And that might mean, as Shelby said, training Navy SEALs on having more productive conversations with village elders in a conflict theater without resorting to use of force. It might mean working with individual members of Congress and their staffs trying to crack the nut of bipartisanship. If you couldn't guess already, I'm based in and horribly jaded by Washington, D.C. The problem with this type of specific work is that it often denies the ability to zoom out and look at the big picture, which means as a practitioner working with clients on specific issues, I probably have a bias on what peace building means in more broader contexts. And more specifically, who is responsible for it? I do work, a lot of work in Israel, Palestine with relatively senior officials, diplomats, and other leaders. And before COVID, I would travel to the region quite a bit. It's very strange to not be traveling, as many of us can attest. And when I think of peace processes and peace building in Israel, Palestine, I think of stakeholder mapping, right? I think about mapping the landscape, understanding the landscape of all the players, And the first parties I think about are government, right? I think about those involved in security. I think about diplomacy. I think about trade. When I think about the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland, the first thing I think about are the Mitchell Principles and the mediation efforts of former US Senate Majority Leader George Mitchell. When I think about peace-building efforts in Aceh in Indonesia, I think about the mediation work of a former Finnish president, Martti Ahtisaari. When I think about Colombia, I think about the FARC negotiations with the government, right? I then might think about advocacy groups with vested interests in whatever government does. I then think about private sector for how we can partner in implementing any agreements. And I think about NGOs then holding those parties' feet to the fire and doing critical direct service work on the ground. I, probably like many others, have a blind spot when it comes to religion and the role it does play and can play. I should have realized this when I was in East Jerusalem a few years back, and I was sitting in the lobby of the Notre Dame of Jerusalem Center, a beautiful old and simple hotel frequented by many pilgrims coming through, right across the street from the old city and the Via Dolorosa and all of that. And I was waiting for a ride, just sort of soaking in the sights, looking around the lobby and people watching. And suddenly I see 3 people walking together, and it was a priest, a rabbi, and an imam. And they're walking by, and I think to myself, well, this sounds like the beginning of a joke. And sure enough, they walk right by me and go straight into the bar. And I'm like looking for someone else to share this with. If anything, and despite my own Episcopal faith, I have viewed the role of religion in conflict as an unconstructive one, where violence is often waged in the name of religion, and it's the responsibility of stakeholders to keep faith at a distance, to manage it, to neutralize it. I am really excited for this panel to challenge that assumption and chip away at this blind spot that I have and that some of us might have. Basically, I'm just excited to learn. So the question that we are tasked with addressing today is this. When there are many people who might see religion as a hindrance to peace building, as a barrier to overcome in any peace process, is it possible for religion to be a part of such a process? And if so, how? I assume the answer will be yes, but how? This wonderful panel will discuss how actors within communities of faith can work to end and even prevent conflict at both the grassroots community level and the highest levels of diplomacy. With that, I am excited to introduce this panel. I'll introduce everyone in alphabetical order, and we'll have each give around a 7-minute presentation, and then we'll open it up for questions. But let me first start with Dr. Andrea Bortoli. He is the president of the I always have trouble saying this, Sant'Egidio Foundation for Peace. How did I do, Dr. Bortoli? Did I get it right?
It's very good. Sant'Egidio.
Okay, great. Foundation for Peace and Dialogue. He works primarily on peacemaking and genocide prevention. He is a member of the steering group of the Global Action Against Mass Atrocity Crimes, a member of the Global Steering Committee chaired by the UN Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide, and a member of the UNHCR Multi-Religious Council of Leaders. He has been involved in the Catholic Peacebuilding Network since its founding. We then have the Right Reverend Mark D.W. Eddington, who is Bishop in charge of the Convocation of Episcopal Churches in Europe. Bishop Mark has worn many hats, having worked as an ordained Episcopal priest, a higher education executive, a social entrepreneur, and writer and editor. His work has appeared in The Atlantic, Le Monde, and the New York Times, and he holds degrees from Albion College, the Fletcher School, and Harvard Divinity School. Miss Martine Miller is the Vice President of the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy and assists in coordinating efforts at the Peace and Conflict Studies program at Chulalongkorn University based in Bangkok. She is a mediator and conflict transformation specialist with over 20 years of experience, engaging her directly in fluid war to post-war reconstruction and development contexts across 80 countries. She is a guest lecturer at American, Duke, Durham, Georgetown, and Chulalongkorn University. And Dr. Chris Seipel. He is Principal Advisor to the Templeton Religion Trust Covenantal Pluralism Initiative. He's a Senior Fellow at the University of Washington's Jackson School of International Studies and has his own consulting firm, the Sage Stone Group. A former U.S. Marine Infantry officer, he has served on the U.S. Secretary of State's Religion and Foreign Policy Working Group and was an inaugural member of the Commandant's Strategic Initiatives Group at the Pentagon. He's authored a book on the U.S. military and NGO relationship and humanitarian interventions and holds degrees from Fletcher, the Naval Postgraduate School, and Stanford University. Welcome to all of you. We're thrilled to have you here, and I'm thrilled to see where this conversation goes. So as I mentioned, about 7 minutes each, then I'll ask a few questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience. In that spirit, if you're in the audience and you have a question, I might suggest you start thinking about it, and feel free to put it in the Q&A feature on Zoom, and we'll see what we get. I would also suggest directing them to one or a few of the panelists, if you can, so that it doesn't take us the entire time to just get through one question, if you would. So with that said, let me turn to Dr. Bartoli to kick us off, if you would.
Thank you. This is lovely to be here. Delighted to be back at Fletcher. I like these connections. I think that we actually need these spaces. You know, it's very important to keep the academic settings as a way to think the future. I think we are entering as human family in a moment that is calling us to a responsibility of thinking the future properly. And I think it's important for academic centers not to give up this role. So I am actually delighted that you decided to do this panel and to do it this way. I like the title. I must say that a power like no other is very appropriate in this case. But I honestly think that before I go to my yes on why religion can be a powerful force for peace building, I think it's important for us to realize that religion is a powerful force that is violent and intolerant, and especially against its enemies, especially its internal enemies. And I think that in that sense, I am happy to share the panel with a few other Christians that are not as Catholic as I am. You know, we have Orthodox, Protestant, Episcopalian, different kind of Christians. But I think that it's important for us to acknowledge that Christianity itself killed Christians in significant numbers, and that past is past. And yet, in a university setting like ours, it's important to revisit that past critically so that learning can come and new understanding can be shaped in such a way that the future will not be as gruesome as the past. But I think that there is an important set of responsibilities that comes from saying who we have been to one another. Christianity, religion, any form of spiritual life is not disembodied. It's always somewhere in somebody, by somebody. And so let me go to my yes to Nassim intuitive sense, you know, that the panel will move in that direction. One first observation is obviously that religion is at the heart of the human person. We are humans first, and because we are human, we are spiritual. We are clearly made of chemical parts. You know, we are clearly made of chemicals, literally. And in a Christian tradition, yesterday we enter into this moment of Lent in which we are reminded that we are ashes, and ashes we will be. So every human person is clearly mortal. There is no doubt that there is a materiality to our body. But our body is clearly capable of speaking, as I'm doing with you today, is clearly capable of remembering and thinking the future. We are all spiritual, and this recognition is very, very significant. Religion is also everywhere. Everywhere there is a human person, there is a spiritual presence. And it's very old. It's in many ways older than we are, and it's very new. It's changing all the time. That's where religions can become tricky, because religions have difficulties in handling differences within. So one of the greatest enemies, usually the heretics, is the person that is differentiating herself or himself based on the tradition and in a way departing from it. We all know how that was clearly important cleavages among the Christians, still is in Islam and many other religious settings. And yet, peacemaking has been done by religious actors for millennia. On the Christian side, it's very clear that Pope Leo went to speak with the barbarians coming that were clearly very well armed without anything. The founder of the Community of Sant'Egidio that I represent liked to speak about bringing peace with bare hands, with no weapons. But there was a confidence in the word. And the word is spiritual. Because when we are able to hear a word, when we are able to share a word, we are able to share meaning. If we are able to share meaning, we are able to find a path to peace that is at the moment hidden from us, but can be revealed by the searching of us together. It's very clear to me that there is no connection per se between Monsignor Romero and Martin Luther King. But it's difficult not to see the connection of two wonderful preachers, a link that in many ways we can understand better after their death. I wanted to speak for a couple of minutes of a long trajectory that religions have, but also this capacity of spiritual people to read each other and learn from each other. Some of you may know of the story of Henri Dunant and how in Solferino he found human suffering and invented the Red Cross. But maybe not everybody knows about the Emir Abdelkader, that after resisting the French in 1830, decided that war was actually over because the French were using such scorching techniques that it was just impossible for the Algerians to resist. He accepted a settlement and was kept in jail in France for a while and then sent to Damascus. And in Damascus, he saved 5,000 Christians out of Muslim hospitality. Why am I linking the two? Because Emir Abdelkader was actually ahead of his time on the rights of prisoners, on the way you are supposed to wage war. He was a humanitarian before the humanitarians. So much so that now in the Red Cross headquarters, there is an image and a bust of the Emir Abdelkader. The other pair, obviously, is Gandhi's nonviolence linked to Tolstoy nonviolence. Tolstoy, a Christian that is actually not well seen by many Christians. So what I'm trying to say here is that religions has a way to be born again and again. And in my case, I cannot say how marvelous it is to have a pope like Pope Francis that decides to accept the invitation of the Archbishop of Canterbury, to have a gathering with the leaders of South Sudan, and then in that occasion decide to go down to his feet and kiss the feet of the leaders, begging them to give peace to their country. What a gesture. Sant'Egidio has worked out of that gesture 4 agreements, one after the other, and we are still making progress. But my point here is that religions not only can be good for peacemaking, it is good for peacemaking, it's very actively good for peacemaking, but it's also good for religion to see itself as in need of reform, of changing or rethinking the past and move away from the violence of the past and embracing a future in which truly we are creating polities in which everyone is free of being and becoming, where the possibility of searching for the good of all is really real for everyone. I'll stop here for the moment, and then I'll be happy to speak on the question and answer period.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Bartoli. And just a FYI to attendees, if we do get dropped again, you've obviously figured a way back. Let's just keep trying that. We'll let you know if we need to go another path. Great. Excellent. Thank you. Bishop Mark Eddington, if you would take us next.
Thanks, Professor Curry. And I guess I want to start by saying the experience that you shared, Nassim, about the work that you do and the kind of peripherality of religion in the assessments that you make, I sure don't think that's anything new. I'll speak as a person who was a student at the Fletcher School right as the Cold War was ending. And I can testify that among the many tools that I got to put in my toolbox, studying as a student at Fletcher, comparative religion was not among them. It was not a thing that we picked up as young people wanting to go out and understand the systems that made the world work and help to make the world a better place. That was a lot later to have to pick that up. So what I found is as a person beginning to have an interest in the role of religion as an animating force in the conflicts of the world was that the people that I worked with, who were incredibly smart, incredibly dedicated, incredibly patriotic, and were involved in conflicts like Yugoslavia falling apart in the early 90s, simply didn't have any tools to understand these things. And they were seeing these conflicts through lenses that we had ground in, the work that we'd done in graduate school in the late 80s and early 90s that just had no place for understanding these issues. The good news is that that's changed. And now, to be a foreign service officer or to be a person who works in a region where religion is a force that motivates human conduct and value creation, yeah, you have to have that set of tools in order to function well as a professional, as a diplomat, as a negotiator, as an NGO leader in that world. That's all good. But here's what I'd say as a person who's kind of made a long arc from the life of the academy and the life of the think tank to what I do now in a uniform like this one. I think when we first began to engage again with the idea that religion had a place in the conversation around foreign policy, had a place in the conversation around peace building and peacemaking in a lot of different contexts in the world, we saw this as something at a sort of 35,000 foot level. We were talking about major systems of value creation and visions of the imminent that were coming into conflict. And it's sort of the Sam Huntington Clash of Civilizations idea of religion, right? And so when I was senior administrator at the Center for the Study of World Religions at Harvard, we did a lot of work around sort of that very top level interfaith dialogue, a thing that everybody on my screen has been deeply involved in and with great accomplishment, because we sort of saw the picture that way. But, as Andrea has said, religion itself is in need of reform and religion itself is changing. And within our religious communities is where the source of a lot of conflict is now. So what I see doing the work I do, two things that I would offer, and I'll just sort of wrap it up with this. One is, I think that there's now, especially in contexts of where multicultural societies are present, there's a need within each religious community to sort of sort through how it's going to come to a common understanding of how the claims of that faith get translated into a democratic society. And here in France, where I'm at, that's at the moment a really important conversation. I'm sitting here talking to you as a Christian priest and a person who works in a Christian community, but in a country that has the largest Islamic population outside of the Islamic world. And in the French mind right now, that's a very difficult thing because it's very threatening. It's seen as a thing that needs to be contained, restricted, and that it needs to have controls placed on it because it's seen as separatist. Now, that sort of points me in the direction of the second point I'd like to offer us to think about, and that is the power of religion to be a source of an alternative vision, a values mediating system that offers people a way of understanding the meaning of life outside of the consumerist culture that's sold to us every day, outside of the quantitative value that the market gives us. But in terms of the human experience, the ability of religion to do that is really shaped by the cultural context in which people of faith exist. And right now, in a lot of the West, religion is actually seen as opposed to a dominant secularist view of how society should be run. So most of you know, participants on this call will know that here in France just this week, a law was passed about separatist Islam. We can't really say it that way because we can't pick out a single faith system, but that's clearly what the intent is. But what's behind that, in my own understanding, is the view of the state that it ought to have a monopoly on the teaching of moral ideas, and an unwillingness on the part of the state to accept the notion that religion has a role in offering an alternative moral vision for society, for community, and for how people make meaning in their lives. This law that's just been passed here in France is kind of part of an early spring bloom in Europe of laws like this. You might also know about a law that's been proposed in Denmark that would require everybody who preaches a sermon to submit that sermon to the government in Danish, which would be hard for my people. We can probably manage to do it, but it has a clear purpose that isn't really about teaching people Danish. And there are similar proposals now kind of being brooded around in Germany. So I think two things that are in play here when we talk about a power like none other. Religion has a place in dealing, in helping to mediate community conflicts at every level, not just the 35,000 foot level. What Greg Boyle is doing with Homeboys Industries in Los Angeles is a power like no other, peace building in the local community. But at the same time, the societies in which we live, the governance of our countries is less and less open to the role of religion in offering that balm to conflict. So I think we have some work to do in sort of translating out ourselves and what we have to offer in societies as they become more secular. And I'll just stop there.
Great. Thank you, Bishop. Let's turn to Miss Miller.
Right, wonderful. First, I'd like to just celebrate the fact that the students that are engaged in Fletcher and their proactive engagement in looking at the religious dimension in space. I received an email from Shelby and Chris, and they were very enthusiastic. Chris was actually a former intern at the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy, where I've been working. So it's a pleasure, and congratulations on looking at this and bringing people together, particularly this esteemed panel to talk about this topic. I'm going to leap off with what Mark has mentioned here in regards to religion bringing community together. So first I'd like to say a little bit about, I think religion has been framed, particularly in kind of in the media, as something to be feared and be concerned about, and particularly utilizing and leaping off the 9/11 dynamics that we witnessed in the United States and how that rippled and created a global ripple effect. But I think if we look behind and we look at different peace initiatives that are happening on a community-based level up to the national level and to the regional levels, we're going to find that religion itself plays a pretty insignificant role, not only in Africa and Asia and other locations, but also if we look at the domestic space of the United States right now, which I think is quite significant to also dive into in regards to the divisions that are happening and the role of religion in that. But one thing I would say is if we look behind those headlines, we're going to find a lot more happening. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work that we've been doing at the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy to uncover that and unpack that a little bit. first I'll dive into, and Andre is kind of the person, at the top of the totem pole in this. But one thing that we're working with is we're looking at the role and trying to understand the role of religious actors in the formal level peace processes. So we're doing a collaboration with the U.S. Institute of Peace and an organization called Inclusive Peace with Tanya Puffenhoff, where we're looking at studying this specifically. So we started this initiative in Belfast. We hosted an initial meeting in Belfast, and we brought religious actors from all over the world to Belfast to talk about these dynamics and to also study the Northern Ireland process. And then we've done a round of consultations where we're specifically looking at what are the nuances and dynamics of the roles of religious actors, positive and negative, in track 1 formal peace processes. We found that to be quite significant in the sense that when speaking with religious actors on a regional, country, and global scale, they hold such an important constituency. So if you look at the space within Myanmar, for instance, the Buddhist clergy hold a very strong constituency. If you look at the space in southern Thailand, where there's conflict in the southern Thailand dynamics, the religious actors play a significant role. The same when we were talking about Aceh. So when we're looking at that track 1 process, it's quite significant to have an understanding of what role religious actors have played and haven't played or could have played in that space. So for instance, this initiative came out of initial understanding of the Sri Lanka process, where the Sri Lanka process had failed. And one key component of that failure was a lack of recognition of the role of religious actors in Sri Lanka and how they would have been able to engage. So that's one thing that we're specifically looking at to try to understand and lift that up into like a global spotlight in some respects. Another thing that we're working on is specifically looking at the role of women of faith and youth of faith in peacemaking. And we have several studies that are ongoing that we're covering: Libya, Kenya, Nigeria, Colombia, Syria, Afghanistan, Myanmar, and the Philippines on this particular case. And one thing that we're finding is women of faith are playing a very invisible role, but a significant role in engaging in peace efforts at the community level, up to the regional levels, and up to the national level. One thing, two highlights to that: I've worked closely in the past with a colleague that was assassinated for her work, but her name was Zakia in Afghanistan. And her role was really, from her faith perspective, to bring communities together to talk about peace. And her community protected her. She started a radio station that broadcast in Afghanistan under the Taliban in post-Taliban times, and really talked about peace initiatives within the Afghanistan space. The interesting thing about that was she was so well respected for her role as a woman of faith that her community kept her safe. So when there were people looking for her to particularly target her, no one would uncover who she was until they finally found her in 2005. And she was assassinated in 2005. But she had played a huge role in her community, looking at bringing community together around the conflict dynamics, but also domestic dynamics within family structures. Another colleague named Dr. Parashat unfortunately passed away from cancer a couple of years ago, but she was heavily engaged in the South Thailand initiatives. And so she would speak across both lines of the division in South Thailand, and was very well respected for her just being a person of faith, understanding different religions. She was Buddhist, and she studied Christianity. She had a PhD in Christianity studies. And so she worked across the different faith groups in Southern Thailand to really support initiatives in Southern Thailand at the community to try to push forward the peace process in the South. One other thing she did was she worked very closely with women of faith to cut across division lines, where they would do initiatives together around health, education, to support the community. And so you see a great deal of initiatives, not only in Southern Thailand space, but on a global scale, where women of faith are able to cut across those lines, utilizing their faith and utilizing kind of the spirituality to be able to broach conflict. And those are some things that we're not paying enough attention to. So we're doing case studies specifically on that to better understand their role and how significant that is in peacemaking efforts. So just putting in a practical element into the discussions there. And now I'll hand off to Nazim.
Great. Thank you, Martine. Let us go to Dr. Seipel.
Well, good afternoon. You can hear me okay?
Can hear you.
Yeah, I said good afternoon because I'm in Seattle and not on the East Coast, not at the center of the universe. So I joined Mark in that perspective. And the sun just came out, which of course is a sign of divine serendipity, as opposed to what happened to Andrea earlier, where he got shut down. So sorry that happened. I've never seen that happen before in my life. Also, our kids just got off school. We have 5 kids. And if you want a practicum or a simulation, not a simulation in peacekeeping, just come to my house. You can babysit these things all the time. And I'd be very happy for that. So I come from that kind of grounded experience. I thought that I would talk about Fletcher and how it brought me to where I am today, and then some lessons along the way, and then none of which will be explained, but we can talk about in Q&A. But 21 years ago, this spring semester, I took the beloved Eileen Babbitt's negotiation course that Nassim now teaches. And it was wonderful. I did not have a framework for thinking about things. And in that course, we read what many in the field start with is this book, Getting to Yes, by Roger Fisher and William Ury. And for those watching who may not know about that book at all, it provides a very simple framework for understanding negotiation and peace building. On one level, there are positions. It's a zero-sum world. The pie is only so big. It's a dog-eat-dog world, and everybody's wearing milk-bone underwear, and what's mine is mine, and what yours is negotiable. And then if you want to understand, be a little bit more sophisticated, what Ury and Fisher suggested was don't look at the positions, look at the interests behind the positions. They don't take their positions because they want to be in the fight. They take them for other reasons that you may or may not understand. And that made a lot of interest to me coming out of the Marine Corps because I understood self-interest in national security and realpolitik. But what left me slightly disenfranchised as a person of faith was that framework was only transactional. That framework was about arbitration, mitigation, resolution, if you're lucky, but only for a period of time. And I didn't know why it bothered me so much for the same reasons that, as Mark alluded to, I didn't know why my education bothered me so much because I took 36 graduate courses at the Naval Postgraduate School and Fletcher combined. And 2 of them mentioned religion. This is pre 9/11. I was totally disaffected by that. And I couldn't figure it out because I bought into this, secularist mindset. The 2 courses that mentioned religion, by the way, were religion as a catalyst to conflict. It's part of the problem. It could never be a part of the solution. So I started doing our work with the Institute for Global Engagement and working across Asia, from China, Vietnam, Laos, Myanmar, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Iraq, North Africa, and got to travel a lot as Mr. Magoo. It wasn't very hard to find Waldo in some of those pictures as I traveled. But in one of those travels, I came across a guy. I sat down with him for breakfast because I wanted to meet somebody new. And it was this guy from Nigeria. His name is Imam Ashafa. Some of you know him. And he said this, which I've never forgotten. He said, if a conflict not transformed is a conflict transferred. And finally, I understood what bothered me about the Fisher-Ury book. I had no lens, nothing to, if I had positions and then interest, I had no way of thinking about the heart behind the interest. And if you see through the eyes of the heart, then there's the potential to see the enemy or the adversary or the opponent as part of your own identity. And that's what I was missing. And that's what my own faith teaches. I happen to be a Christian. So I'm commanded to love God and love neighbor, also enemy. I have no way to understand that sometimes. What are the skills that get me there? And so certainly you can have the eyes of the heart to see the interest and see the positions from a secular or humanist point of view. But people of faith ought to have the eyes of the heart according to their own holy scriptures, their own oral traditions about how the conflict is not transactional, but transformational by their role in it. That's what people of faith should have something to say about. Of course, religion is a part of the problem, always has been. And once it's instrumentalized, it makes the conflict much harder to deal with. So here are some takeaways over my years of experiences, and I'll get off the dais here. One is only the best of faith defeats the worst of religion. And by that, I mean faith as the mystery and mercy and majesty of something greater than yourself, which means you don't have the answers. Religion is not a bad word, but religion tends to me, in my mind, be institutionalized. And once it's institutionalized, it has the answers, then it speaks for the mind of God, and then it validates violence against innocence. That's how it rolls. Second, you've got to work in what I would call a track 1.5 manner. If you believe in faith and you believe people of faith are in all vocations, you believe in God, you believe he's sovereign over all things. Well, you got to work with government, to Nassim's opening comments, but you also got to work with grassroots. And in conflict resolution speak, track 1 is government to government, track 2 is people to people. Track 1.5 at their intersection is the point of sustainability. You got to talk to both. Third, you got to be comfortable with multi-faith, not interfaith. Again, interfaith is a good word. I'm just using this to poke and provoke conversation. But multi-faith means there are irreconcilable theological differences about how you think about the eternal, with consequence for those who believe that. I have found that when you're able to talk about those irreconcilable differences, it actually accelerates practical collaboration. Because you don't identify and name the irreconcilable difference to demean and denigrate, but to respect the essence of the other's identity. And then it's a different conversation. Last point that I'll make is this, and Martine alluded to it. You got to include half the sky. The only thing less included than religion and international affairs is women of faith in international affairs. And there's a lot of good thinking that is emerging on this. Catherine Marshall and Susie Hayward have led the way, and Martine as well, but they have to be present. And you have to find ways to move around the often de facto patriarchy of some of the institutions to make sure that they have a seat at the table. Otherwise, you're just playing games. Again, you will not be sustainable. So I'll stop there. And again, thanks to Fletcher for having this time. This is wonderful.
Thank you so much, everyone. I have so many questions myself, and I get to ask a few, which I feel very fortunate about. Here's my first one. And I had just asked everyone in the audience to please direct your question to a specific person. I'm going to go against my own rule because I would love to hear all your thoughts on this. I think it's that important. Chris, you had talked about sort of government to grassroots, right? I'm actually wondering about even wider in terms of the audience. And I'm wondering about the stigma that, led to one of your only 2 courses to one of them being just about how it's a catalyst to conflict. I'm wondering about the stigma that has led, that might be prevalent when, Andrea, you say that, you talk about the need for reform. Martine, you talked about the project with women and youth of faith and how that work was done quietly. And Mark, the work sort of being done on the streets also kind of at that sort of grassroots level. And so I'm wondering, these things have in common that they're sort of, are they in reaction to this sort of broader stigma around the role of religion in peace building? And do we have to work around that by being quiet? Do you have to do that grassroots on the streets, very local stuff in order to be effective? And if not, how do you get over the stigma that is prevalent at the 35,000 foot view, at the government view, if there are plenty of people who think that it is in fact a catalyst to conflict, how do you get over that stigma? So it's a sort of a twofold question in terms of how do you get over that stigma, and does it have to be quiet work? And
I have a reaction, if I may.
please.
And I would push back on both cases, actually, because on the stigma, I would say that, at least for what I could see with Sant'Egidio and the work that we have been doing, there is actually a growing recognition of the usefulness of places where people can explore peace when it's dangerous. And this creates actually interesting conversation for people that are not necessarily negotiating, but are simply knocking at the door of somebody who has a good track record. It's like going to the doctor saying, you know, I have this and I don't know what is happening and all that. And I would say that of the work that Sant'Egidio does, easily 80% is going nowhere. It's going in no direction whatsoever, but simply helping the person that is coming, helping the delegation that is coming, to come to terms with the possibility of peace that is actually emerging. And I think that this role is phenomenal. It's very, very important. It's not a question of putting yourself in the forefront of the politics that is public, that is in the media. I think it's much more important to be accessible to the ones that are really making decisions. Quietly, confidentially, old-fashioned way, personally, listening, and then listening some more. I think it's very, very important not to forget the power of listening. Because listening does something extraordinarily important to the speaker, who is usually not capable of articulating peace words in an environment that is at war. One, because to articulate those peace in the wrong place at the wrong time is just, you know, a death sentence. You just cannot do it. And two, because you don't have the elements to put them all together. So I think that religious peacemaking in particular has this quality of eliciting the possibility of peace in quarters and through people that may not have been ready for it. And in that sense, I really think that it's important to recognize what is happening when it's happening. I was mentioning South Sudan and Pope Francis and Archbishop Welby and this work and so on. But I do think that what we see actually is also this creativity of communities responding so much that people have, you know, the idea of protecting mosque when you have Islamophobia frenzy. You know, you have situation in which you are intervening in each other's defense, and I think that this is actually going to happen more. That's my sense.
Excellent. Others, Chris, Martine, Mark?
I'll take a swing. Three things come to mind off the top of my head. One is people of faith have to provide a product so good it can't be ignored. If you're good and you're excellent, who cares what your motivation is? Who cares what your means are? Judge me by my results. So that's where I will come down every single time. Second, I do think that there has been a problem of secular fundamentalism within the academy for many years to deal with these issues. And it's just a delight to think that Elizabeth is at Fletcher teaching this and able to talk about it. And the way the academy thinks about this is now we have to have a desecularization process. And the rest of the world, the bottom-up cultures of the world say, what are you talking about? We've always been here. Culture, religion and culture are intermeshed, and it provides an explanatory framework for life and death and meaning and purpose. And where you been, political scientists? So they got to come to grips with that. in the academy across many disciplines, comparative religion has to be reimagined in some ways and then integrated with international studies. That's a conversation we're having at the University of Washington. And here's my third point. I think that it's incumbent upon us to make this more accessible to ordinary people, not ordinary people, but people who might have a secularist de facto mindset. And so it's a whole nother conversation, but I've been working a lot on developing a concept called cross-cultural religious literacy, which is about skill sets of engagement. And you talk about skills of engagement, evaluation, negotiation, communication that are secular words and are transferable across disciplines and vocations and locations, but they're basically about reconciliation. And they're basically another way of saying, this is what people of faith and people of values bring to a transactional exchange and give it hope for becoming transformational.
Excellent. Mark or Martine? If you want to build on anything, or?
Go, Martine.
Just jump in for 1 second. So my background, I've been predominantly out of the United States, about 25 years working in different countries in conflict settings. So for instance, 4 or 5 years living in Afghanistan, living in South Sudan, Northern Uganda, Eastern Congo, Sierra Leone. And religion is a part of society. Religion is a part of culture. It plays out every single day. Where we have our hiccup is when we're talking about U.S. government, European Union, the Western actors that have concerns around the engagement of religion. So for instance, when I first started, what I wanted to do professionally was I wanted to understand the nuances of different agencies and organizations and how you maneuver within them based on their mandate and maneuver around them based on their mandates. And so one of my first positions was with DRL at Department of State. And that was under Albright's administration. And it was very clear that religion was not a space or a topic to be had at that point. But that certainly changed over time. And I've worked very closely, many of you know Doug from International Center for Religion Diplomacy, where he wrote some of the very first books many years ago that looked at religion and policy and peace. And so really pushing that, that boundary there was the founder of the organization that I've been doing a lot of work with. But I think this really rests, these challenges that we're seeing in this discussion really rest, within the US discussions or the European discussions and not elsewhere, because at Chula University, where I'm doing work, it's not uncommon to talk about religion and religious dynamics in politics or in peace or any efforts within the Asia space, for instance. So it's not something that's segregated out. So just to put that on the table. The other thing is in regards to the US space, I'm going to touch on some sensitive topics. I come from rural Indiana. My parents live in rural Tennessee. My younger sister is in Texas. I come from a very conservative family. And I'm going to share this diplomatically. There is a lot of work to be done. We need to have very serious conversations on the role of religion and peacemaking in the US domestic space. Because exploring the different dynamics, the different discussions happening within groups. I'm in a lot of different chat groups, and those discussions that are happening are very violent. And it's driven, I can tell you, from having been in churches within the Midwest, there is significant drive happening within the churches. And how do you work with the religious community in spaces where people are feeling disenfranchised and working with them to talk about how do we bring people together? And that will be a significant role in the United States that we really definitely need to address as the country, where the country is today. And I'm not sure I articulated that very well. I've been on meetings very late in the evenings with Myanmar counterparts in the religious community in Myanmar lately because of the dynamics happening there. And you see even in the Myanmar space, the role of religious actors and the religious actors even coming up and saying, hey, when the dynamics were happening with the Rohingya within the country, we should have done something. We should have done more. We should have been outspoken on these dynamics. So you're seeing that come up now, that the communities now are coming together in support of each other. So I apologize if I'm not very articulate on this, but I think it's interwoven in absolutely everything. And I think that from the Western perspective, or the US perspective, the European perspective, we want to try to ignore it, but we can't, because it's evidently there, and it's boiling up on, in our grounds in the United States at the moment as well.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thanks, Martine.
I just want to totally align myself with what Martine has just said about the internal challenge in the United States. I think there's an echo of that, interestingly, in the Islamic community here in France. Different reasons, but same sort of dynamic. And I just add two quick thoughts, because this is such a rich conversation. For a long, long time, when we have this conversation about the role of religion in world affairs, the way we kind of ghettoize this is to say religion's job is to solve the problem of religion. But actually, religion has a lot to say about a whole host of other issues that are kind of right up in front of us right now, like the climate. Every religious tradition has something to say about the dignity and value of the creation that is a vision alternative to the idea of the extractive value of the earth around me. So there's something on offer there that we need to be willing to draw on. Same, in the question of either those disenfranchised folks in the Midwest of the United States or young Islamic men living in the banlieue here near Paris, what they're searching for is dignity. And religion has a way of offering an account of how humans can realize and sense dignity within human community in this life. So, coming back to what Chris said, if you want to really experience a multi-faith, not interfaith, a multi-faith conversation about issues of value, come hang out with me at the soup kitchen at my cathedral some Tuesday afternoon. Because what you'll meet are people who are really struggling from a huge variety of the world's religious traditions, but are caught up in the common purpose of finding dignity in this life, which is something that the culture wants to take away from them.
Thanks, Mark. Maybe I want to jump on that a bit before we turn to audience questions. And Mark, if I could just build on that and then go back to a point you made earlier. You used the term alternative vision. Can we offer an alternative vision for folks to provide some sort of moral leadership? And I'm just wondering, my practitioner brain goes to the how. What does that look like? How does an alternative vision come about? Does it need to be embedded within popular culture? Does it need to be just sort of on a very grassroots sort of community level? But what is the kind of theory of change, if you will, on implementing that or realizing that alternative vision?
Again, if I can go first, I don't know. Can I?
Sure. Let's go to Andrea, and then maybe Mark, if you have a thought on that.
Actually, why don't you go first, Mark?
Okay, thanks, Andrea. So Nassim, I'll answer you this way. One of the things I got to do in my years working at Harvard was to be a teaching fellow with Harvey Cox, who was been a huge amount to me and was hugely influential on my thinking. And Harvey had this way of sort of beginning the conversation about understanding religion and society by getting people to come to grips with this basic fact: humans are meaning-making creatures. This is how we are wired. Humans are meaning-making creatures. And so, my answer to the question, Nassim, that you pose in the mediation thing, which is about what are the interests behind the position, the way I want to have that conversation is I am really interested in understanding what another person regards as sacred. What is the sacred for you? And I find that that's a way that I can have that conversation even with people who regard themselves as absolutely secular. Because if we talk about the things that sort of cause us the very fundamentally human experience of stopping in awe and wonder at something, that's for me where that conversation can find common ground. And from that, I can begin an exchange of ideas about what is my vision for how this thing that's sacred gets sort of scaled up into the community I want to build. That's a religious question. Ultimately, religions have a different account of how to answer that question, but that's a question that we can engage that on that level. That's my answer.
Right. Andrea?
Well, my response goes in the direction of modeling. I think that the way to do it is by models and choosing your model. We are celebrating a visit of a relatively young person. His name was Francis of Assisi, who decided to visit the Muslim leaders in the middle of a crusade. The spirit is always embodied, is always somewhere. So it's not that there is a religion somewhere out there, it's always within. And in that sense, I think that it is an enormous creativity that comes when you take yourself seriously in relation to the spirit that is speaking through you. And as a community, I think that we have the responsibility of memory. If you don't mind, I would like to show this image very briefly that is very important for those who are with the community of Sant'Egidio. Is an image of the new martyrs. Many people don't realize that more Christians were killed in the last century than in all the centuries combined before. This is just because the numbers, humans are more in recent times. But you have the responsibility of remembering. And if you look at this image, this is in Rome in a church called San Bartolomeo. Here you have Romero and a king together. So this is clearly an Orthodox tradition reappropriated in a different image and different style. And then here you have the so-called martyrs of Bhutan. These are the martyrs that decided to stay together when the armed faction asked them, are you Hutu or are you Tutsi? They were all killed. But if there is a possibility of peace in Burundi today, it's because of that martyrdom. And then here you have the memory of the time in the gulags, Soviet gulags, when religions was abolished. You could not even have a Bible. And people in jail just gave the book one to a different person. This person learned the book by memory and then became that book for the others so that they could remember the word that was given to them. So I'm offering this to say religion is fairly creative. And religious people, spiritual people can be creative in searching peace, especially when they are looking for the peace of all. And again, I insist on the idea that we need to come to terms with our own violence and intolerance, especially against those who are not as religious as we are or as religious as we want them to be. I repeat and continue to repeat this mantra that Christians killed Christians for a long time. And I think that we didn't do enough of a good job in learning from that killings. And that's the space where universities can help us. That's a space where Harvey Cox of the day can help us to make meaning out of a tragedy that it was our own doing.
Excellent. In the spirit of learning, I want to move to a question from the audience. And this is from Kate. She directs this at Chris. And I want to actually expand it to Martine, because Martine, you actually mentioned a little bit about this. Speaking of sort of context of learning, maybe we're not doing that much learning. She says, lately I've noticed that party identity she's saying Republican versus Democrat itself is taking on a sort of religious character. there is faith in espoused doctrine, beliefs that opposing views are wrong or immoral, and blind followership of leaders and the things they say. Do you think that there are tools in the religion, law, and diplomacy toolbox that can be applied to the increasingly violent partisan divide in the US? And I might just expand that to ask anywhere when the politics and religion are sort of enmeshed in that way. What are the tools in the toolbox? So Chris or Martine, I might direct that one to either of you to kick us off. Maybe Martine, since you had started going down that path earlier, we can elaborate on it.
It's a bit of a rabbit hole for me because it's something that is a very personal dynamic that's developed. And I think many people, we're seeing that expressed a lot, where families are breaking apart because of the political religious dimensions of the current dynamics within the United States. I would say one thing that we've been looking at is the role of seminaries, the role of religious actors within communities to work closely with their communities to open up discussions. And I think that's something that hasn't been done in the US space effectively, particularly the places where I've had the opportunity to frequent and try to understand. But I think that in essence, it's really opening up dialogue, coming into the same room with another and having those conversations and creating safe space for that. I don't know, everything is about also timing of things. So I would have to say I'm perhaps a little bit too close to be as analytical as I would like to be because of personal experience, but I'm going to hand over to Chris just to see what he has to say about that so I can learn from him as well.
Thanks, Martine. I'm kind of curious what I'm going to say too. Multi-faith is hard. Intrafaith is harder. The only people that I've experienced that have lied about me or gone out of their way to demean me have been my fellow co-religionists. I'm sure there's bad Muslims out there and bad other folks, but intrafaith is hard. I've had very positive experiences with other faiths. So you have to understand that. And as you engage, going back to something, I think it was Mark that said, how do you, or the power of religion is enabling the empathetic and elicitive encounter. And if you can't live that with your own faith and within your own faith, then you kind of have no business doing it outside the faith. And I'm not saying it's either or, but you've got to be able to engage others, because here's the thing, this idea of religious nationalism, I juxtapose that with faithful patriotism. That's another contrast, but it's a global phenomenon. And the only way that you're going to beat religious nationalism is when the people of the majority tribe police their own ranks and speak into their own ranks. And that's a hard thing to do. That's the interfaith piece. But the thing that unites all this, and this gets back to the way I've thought about my last 25 years, are these three skill sets of evaluation, negotiation, and communication. And just to illustrate a little bit, when we had talk about skill sets, when I was advising the USAID and other folks in the State Department, there was a strong reluctance to look within the self and what you're bringing to the table. And my feeling is that's where you have to start. And this is Andrea's point. You have to look within, because if you're just looking to engage others for your own purpose, by definition, you're utilitarian. Okay, that's the interest of the state. That's what foreign policy experts do. Okay, I get it. On the other hand, if you're a human, you can't help but change as you interact with folks who have different beliefs than you do. And you've got to know what in your own faith tradition is ideology and what is identity. And this is the conversation that has to happen in America, especially when we think about things like racial relations. How does the white church, by and large, understand suffering? How does the Black church understand suffering? Generally speaking, two very different experiences. And And theoretically, the faith ought to combine, right? There are no Hutus and Tutsis, there's just Christians, but that's not what happened. And religion gets manipulated to validate political entrepreneurs, and that's how you start down this slippery slope. So all of that to say, you've got to have some skill sets. You've got to be, but the number one skill set is being humble and listening to yourself and to the people that you're seeking to engage, and then figuring out how and when to speak. And many times in the initial rounds, it's important not to speak at all. Just listen.
Thanks, Chris. I think this idea of intra being potentially the most difficult is really profound. That is the hardest work, right? How do we clean our own house? And what does that look like? And why is change so hard internally? And you know, Andrea sort of kicked us off today saying that internal reform is critical. So how does that actually happen? I want to turn to a question. This is for Mark from Saba. How has French, I'm trying to, apologies for messing this up. How's laïcité, I assume? French secularism interpreted as the freedom from religion impacted new legislation that targets Muslim communities? And are there active conversations in France now to reform or abandon the cultural/political idea of it? Mark, can you answer that one?
It's a really interesting question, and thanks for that question. So laïcité is a pretty complicated subject, but to try to sort of bring it into the frame of this conversation, it's the cultural expression of the legal commitment to secularism in the French Constitution. And it derives from a long history in French culture and society about the relationship between state power and the church, and specifically the Catholic Church in France. But in short form, what it really means is that it is the secular presumption of state affairs is taken as absolute. So for example, I wrote a piece here recently, I ran in Le Monde, holding up to a French audience the wild idea of Raphael Warnock being elected to the United States Senate, a thing that would never happen in France. Why? Not because he's a Black man, but because he's a Christian pastor who has a church in Atlanta that he intends to keep pastoring while he's a member of the United States Senate. Absolutely would not happen in France, because it wouldn't be seen that a person of professed religious faith who's actually an ordained minister and engaged in the life of the church would be qualified to be in public office. So laïcité is a sort of cultural presumption about how the legal commitment to secularism is worked out in life. So, you know, you even my going about like this on public transportation, sometimes the French folk in my community worry about me because they feel that it's a little bit too outré. That's a sort of simplified answer, but that's the answer.
I want to take a question from Sarah here. I'm wondering, and this is for Martin. I'm wondering what, if any, systems you have seen successfully transition, and I think the key word here is transition, peacemaking, peace building into a cultural change or shift towards multi-religious identity within community. We've been touching on these ideas around dealing with other communities, right? And what does that actually look like? Have you seen it successfully work to have that sort of move towards multi-religious identity within that community?
So this is an interesting question. One thing I would say, we're currently doing work that covers South and Southeast Asia that when it started, we were looking at epicenters of division and conflict around religious identities. And when that epicenter would spark, what would be the ripple? So when you have a situation in Sri Lanka where you have Buddhist community members that attack a Rohingya refugee camp, What is that? How does that play out in Indonesia for a minority Buddhist community in Indonesia? And if you have an attack on a Christian community in Sri Lanka, how does that play out in another part of the region? So we were looking at the epicenters and sparks of conflict and how it would ripple. And one thing that we've seen, and I know this doesn't get directly to the question, but one thing that we've seen is in some places like southern Thailand and communities in Indonesia, where minority-majority dynamics play out, where there's division among community, COVID dynamics have changed that. So we have seen where the Muslim community and the Buddhist communities and small communities within Indonesia have come together, have formed, strong engagements together across those slight division lines that they've experienced in the past, and they're working together as a community. And so when these dynamics kind of ripple from other countries or other parts of the country, it doesn't impact them the same way they used to. So we've had to really rethink some of the research that we're doing. And in the opposite direction, India plays out very differently from what we're seeing. So we're looking at Sri Lanka, India, Bangladesh, Myanmar, Thailand, and Indonesia on that. It doesn't fully get to your question, but what we are seeing is kind of the COVID dynamics are bringing some smaller communities together, where it's breaking down those division lines around, those division lines that were sparked because of religious differences. The other thing I would say is, this is broadly, youth movements and women's movements. Usually, and I know that's not bound by a country or bound by a community, but is a larger community. What thing I'm always impressed by, and anytime I go into a country and I'm working in a specific situation, I look for the women's movements and I look for the youth movements, because they consistently are diverse. So if you look at the Myanmar context, when the dynamics rippled, the dynamics happened against the Rohingya population, the first groups to come forward were the women's movements and the youth movements, and they spoke out in the face of insecurity. And it didn't matter what religion they were, it didn't matter what ethnicity they were, they made public statements and they spoke out. It's the same, you see that across the globe. So there's an organization called, a big shout out to the United Network of Young Peacebuilders. They are from every single faith, every single country, not bound by ethnicities, and they are engaged globally. And so that, I know it's not bound by a country context or a community or anything like that, but you see that within the youth movements and the women's movements that are quite impressive.
Great. And I want to build on a point that Tatiana made in the Q&A, which is around, in this particular panel, we don't have people of other faiths. Tatiana, to that point, there are definitely other panels as part of this series that will have other faiths. There's a panel on gender, and there's a panel featuring an imam, a Catholic priest, etc. So that I raise that to say, A, everyone should go check out those panels, but B, there should also, I'm also curious about how, I want to jump again on Chris, your point around the intra versus the inter. And when we are dealing with other faiths, what is the difference? Why might it be harder to deal with intra? And especially as we're trying to sort of build multi-religious communities internally, are we finding that it actually is always harder intra versus inter? So just, I'm curious if anyone has a thought on that. Maybe Andrea, we haven't heard from you in a little bit, so I might put you on the spot.
I would say that any community is threatened intimately by somebody who is in and different. So the dynamic within the community is clearly very intimate and very dangerous. It's very different. It's very difficult to be a different kind of Christians, a different kind of Muslim, a different kind of Jews. Gandhi was not killed by anybody but a Hindu, and Rabin was not killed by anybody but a Jew, and Sadat was not killed by anybody but a Muslim, and I think, and go on and go on. I think it's the internal violence is very often seen as a way to preserve the identity and therefore to purify this evil, this wrong that is coming out within. So I think that it's very, very important for us to realize these tensions and these difficulties in addressing them. But this is why I'd like also to offer a word of thanks to those who gave us a secular space, those who gave us a space to have religious freedom, those who gave us a space of exploring ways in which we could invite each other into a way of being together that was very difficult to conceptualize in the past. And in that sense, I think that it's important to realize that Christians are not killing Christians anymore the way they were in the past. And it's very important that when we look at the macro image, it's not by chance that De Gasperi, Schumann, and Adenauer were all devout Christians. They were not just Christians. They were definitely interesting people. And there is certainly something about the capacity of religion to actually bring together not only the differences within, for Catholics, Vatican II is a remarkable watershed, and clearly Protestant Catholics are speaking differently today. Protestant and Catholic are speaking very differently with Mennonite and Quaker and Anabaptist tradition within. And this is why I do believe that it's important to have this conversation, because I do believe that there is something to be learned when the secular space is actually helping the spirit to move everybody. Because we must move towards a future that is good for everyone.
And Andrea, one thing that might complicate that is how certain religions are exposed to us. So, and I might direct this at Mark now. This is a question from Chase. How might we address the issue that American exposure to non-Christian faiths, and I might even expand it to any exposure, not just American, to non-Christian faiths such as Islam, come not from practitioners themselves, but from those who fear religions. For example, while growing up in a post-9/11 society in an American suburb, my only exposure to Islam was anti-Muslim propaganda. How could we change that so that young Americans gain true religious exposure from those who represent the best of it rather than the worst of it?
Yeah, I think a big part of that is the alliances that form between well-intended people of different religious traditions. So it's a gesture, even like everybody in a neighborhood putting up a menorah in their window at home when something happens at the local synagogue to sort of give a witness about the legitimacy of that faith tradition in a community. It's about being a good ally when something bad happens in someone else's religious community and you want to show up and say, it's more important that we share together being people of faith than it is to be divided by the different things that in which we believe. But I do think, I mean, in general, and Chris would pick up on this, it's really at root a question about religious literacy in our society. We've taken that for granted in the United States for many, many years. We have a little narrative about how we came to be, which has to do with religion, which is not really that correct, but that's kind of what we think of ourselves about religious tolerance. And we've actually kind of lost fundamental capabilities to understand religious systems, our own and others, which is partly my explanation for why things are as they are in Indiana, Martina, and in my own home state of Michigan. It's pretty much the same. So I think it's really forming alliances of goodwill across the lines that separate religious traditions to show that there are ways in which we can encounter each other and understand each other. That sounds a little bit milquetoast, but I actually think it's hard work to do, and it takes intentionality.
Great. I think we've got time for about one more. I'm going to make this a very quick one, and I'm intrigued to hear the answer to this. This is from John. This is intended for Martine, but I might just open it up, whoever wants to take it very quickly. I would love to know your reaction to the Bruce Springsteen Super Bowl ad. I'm a TV journalist and I've covered religion. I almost gasped when I saw the shot of the cross embedded into the wooden map of the US. Do you believe there was a message behind that, or was it just a hip secular producer from LA who thought it was good B-roll without understanding how poisonous the mix of religion and nationalism is right now? Chris or Martine, or any reactions to that in 30 seconds or so?
I tweeted at the time, like within a few minutes, that I do not like or accept it. It's the wrong message to be sending. Somebody might have been trying to be hip or cool or trying to reach out from the left, but that's not the way to do it. And it's really an insult for Christians because God is bigger than America. And it's just that simple. So that's the way I think about it. One quick point, I know we're in 30 seconds, but the intra thing.
Yeah.
The greater threat than religious illiteracy is scriptural illiteracy within traditions. Traditions have forgotten what it means to be prophetic. And in the Christian tradition, that's not prophesizing the future per se, it's the exhortation to live out the commands of the faith. And there are good people from all faith traditions looking at the golden rule that need to be more prophetic and claiming that internally, such that we all get along better externally in multi-faith and multicultural states. It's the only way we can live with our deepest differences.
I love that. And on that note, I want to turn to Elizabeth for a last word here.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you to all the panelists. Thank you, Nasim, for your just masterful moderation and a little poking with questions. That was wonderful. So thank you to everyone, and thank you to the audience. Before we close, I want to give a shout out to Shelby Sangar, because she was the brains behind this first panel, which launches our 4-panel series. And as I mentioned before, also Francois Venn and Chris Pomford are also somewhere in the back room of the technology booth. Also leaders in the Student RLD Club. But thank you to all of the participants. And one thing that I take away from everything you've said tonight is the importance of recognizing that the issue of pluralism and acceptance of difference is an equal challenge for faith communities as it is for non-faith communities. And in particular, when we were talking about the United States, I was struck by the fact that there's a kind of parallel logic of totalizing exclusivism that works both in some faith communities and in some non-faith communities, a rejection of internal diversity and multivocality. And I think seeing that there are these parallel and similar logics that are oftentimes at work, they occlude the possibilities for faith, non-faith collaboration, and also for the fullness of the contributions that you've all described when it comes to what religion can bring to peace building, and also to the knowledge networks and the epistemic frameworks that all of us use in trying to study and work in the field of international relations and peace building. So I thank all of you very much. I think Chris is throwing up a thank you here too. And again, thank you, Professor Quarry, for moderating and discussing. And thanks to all of you. And we look forward to seeing everyone on the next 3 panels. And Shelby, congratulations.
Thank you. And I just might add my thanks to everyone. And thank you for shedding light on my own biases here. So I'm on my blind spot. I feel very blessed to have been able to be a part of this. So thank you all so much.
Thanks to everyone who tuned in, to all the viewers. This was recorded, and at the end of the 4-panel series, we will pull everything together, and the link will be uploaded onto the RLD site so you can watch again. Thank you.
All the best. Thank you.